Hey, what's up? Today, I want to do a quick video on the psychology of the philosopher, um, and on the psychology of philosophy in general, I guess. Um, Philosophers are human beings and they're not meant to be pedestalized because most philosophies are bad. Or wrong, anyway. Logically wrong, morally incoherent. And why is that? Because philosophers. I mean, I've seen statistics that have shown that philosophers are the most intelligent, like IQ-wise, people in college, along with physicists. They just have two different personality styles and two different sets of interests. One is more big picture, idea oriented. The other is more scientifically and mathematically oriented. So two different styles of personality from two high levels of intelligence. Why is it that most philosophies are wrong, though? And I think it generally boils down to psychology, and in no branch of philosophy is this more apparent than in epistemology. Um, and in theories of truth, uh, and in a philosopher's inability to question his own assumptions or see the logical incoherence of his ideas. So when you hop aboard the truth train, it becomes impossible to hold a relativist position of any sort. And it turns out that, and I'm not going to go into too much technical detail about this, but most philosophies, and all which are, wrong and don't get certain, ground level things right, are reducible to some form of relativism. They're reducible to a relativist theory of truth because they lack logical incoherence, etc. But what we have to remember, again, philosophers are human beings. They're fallible, and what ends up happening, whether they're aware or not, usually they're not, is that a philosopher's ideas can generally be traced back to his psychological inclinations. And so, to some degree, self-awareness is one's awareness of his own psychological functioning, how one is. And then there's another level to that, and that is how you act in accordance with that, morally speaking. Because the whole point to self-awareness, studying personality psychology, we could say, is a tool for that. Along with that, and a higher level to that, is at the same time developing a moral framework. And without a moral framework, self-awareness will delve into nihilism and therefore a relativist philosophy. And that's where I think a lot of philosophers are, and even a lot of just, casual people who are interested in personality psychology, and not, professionally in the business of thinking and writing about ideas. So, bad philosophy breaks down to the rational justification of the psychological inclinations of the philosopher who came up with them. And it's ironic because it's based in a misunderstanding about what justification is. You have to presuppose that truth exists in order to justify anything. Otherwise, your justification isn't pointing toward anything. That's why you justify it. To justify something is to presuppose that truth exists. So that is to presuppose not a relativist philosophy, and to take the steps of, how the form of your idea is in accordance with the truth. So in justification, when you're making logical arguments, there are many argument forms that we could talk about, but the two main ones are modus ponens and modus tollens. Modus ponens is if P, then Q. P, therefore Q. Modus tollens, on the other hand, is basically the negative of that, or the negation of that. If P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. But the converse of that is not true. So, you have to assume something to be true in every argument, if you're having a debate with someone, it's just going to be that, a debate, a fight, a competition for who is right and who is wrong, rather than an orientation toward truth and understanding. And so you have to agree on certain assumptions before you can get anywhere in an argument. But in so many relativist philosophies, first of all, the assumptions are not agreed upon, or not explained, but you still have to sort of justify and trace your assumption back to another proof, another argument, which justifies that assumption, And I think I've been thinking about this a lot, that all arguments that are true, or that have content that is true, remember, because logic is about the form of the argument, not the content, but the fundamental assumption that serves as like the apex of all true arguments, it has to be one singular thing. So every assumption that you make in a modus ponens or a modus tollens argument, that's the if P then Q, that's a conditional statement, has to sort of trace back to another conditional statement that's true. It has to be rooted in something else. And so I think if you follow that chain of, not cause and effect, but chain of conditional statements that are true, if your argument is true, you can trace it back to the fundamental assumption, which is truth exists. And that's the fundamental assumption that we want to make, and that philosophers are trying to uncover, but for some reason they don't want to accept that is it, because they don't want to count out a relativist philosophy, all the while trying to justify relativist philosophies along the way, which, by the way, by their very definition, cannot be justified, because for anything to be justified, you need to presuppose that truth exists. So why not take the fundamental assumption of all truth, that being that truth exists itself? Because when you accept that, a world of learning opens up to you. There's really no limit as to what you can learn and what you can produce on the basis of that. But if you don't accept that truth exists, you're basically not allowed to speak, as Ludwig Wittgenstein would argue in his earlier philosophy. He was very diligent about, saying that, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. In other words, if you're not saying something true, then you shouldn't say anything at all, or that you cannot say anything at all. Everything we say is true and this is back to the original point about psychology. Everything we say is true not in and of its logical, structured, linguistic self, but it's true as an embodiment of something personal, if we really lack that self-awareness, especially. The things we say, the things we try to justify, if they're not true, are simply indicative of psychological states that we have not come to terms with, that we have not become aware of and have not learned to temper. And that's where most philosophers are. They're no more self-aware than anyone else, and they have psychology just like anyone else. And so their ideas are generally going to be a sort of embodiment of psychological states that they have not become aware of yet and have not learned to temper. And many people are inclined toward relativist philosophies. The sort of like postmodern leaning personality is one who, if we frame it in big five terms, is one who is very high in openness, but maybe very low in conscientiousness, probably very high in neuroticism, which is why they can sort of exist in a state of nihilism for an extended period of time. So there's a psychological profile that is associated, I would say, with each philosophy out there. And the key to coming up with a true philosophy is not to come up with it, is not to justify it in order to justify our own ego, which we have not come to terms with, but rather to sort of discover what is true and how we fit into that. What role do we serve as a self-aware person who has to exist with other beings with different psychologies? What is it that ties us all together? And what is it that is true for all of us, regardless of our psychology? So it's kind of a different video, cross between, my Philosopher Friday stuff and my personality stuff, but hope you enjoyed it. And let me know your thoughts. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.